Hi there. I'm Jason Bulmahn. I'm the director of game design at Paizo. And sitting here on a Saturday and been reading a lot of message boards and looking around at things online. And I've been noticing a lot of questions about kind of some economics when it comes to games and how those interact and interface with the play experience. And I thought, you know what? I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and maybe some of you might be interested in hearing them. Um, Before I begin, I want to say that everything that I'm about to say is kind of just my opinion. Um, there's a lot of different theories on how this can work. There's a lot of different ways it does work in many games, and there really isn't a right answer. There's a lot of competing answers, some of which are probably better for one game or another, but in the end, it's all kind of theory craft. And the reason why that is that um, really this is economics uh, in a game, but not real life, right? Real life economics has buy and sell. It has market pressure. It has supply. It has demand. Prices go up based on the amount of labor it takes to make a thing. They go down in spite of that if there's a glut of supply. Fantasy game economics really don't have that. I mean, I think we could build a model that did that, but I don't think any of you would particularly want to play it. I actually think it'd be pretty boring to sit around and do all the math on how copper ore futures are doing in your game. There have been some games in the past that have played with this. There's some MMOs who have very interesting economic models that play around with this. Um, but for most of you playing a tabletop role-playing game, it's probably a bit more than you'd like to do at your table. So, assuming that you're not doing that, and instead you need an economic model that speaks to kind of how you want to play the game, um, you're going to need a system that works for the type of play that you want, that engenders the type of play experience that you want. You want the economics of the system, and that is the gold and the silver and the platinum, and how that plays out in treasure and everything to kind of make sense so that your characters don't end up ridiculously wealthy at low levels, or they're not out begging for coppers at high level. So, how does this all get started? Well, in most kind of fantasy RPGs, you're starting out with what's usually a level-based economic system. So you've got a system where at low levels you are weak and fragile and susceptible to all the dangers in the world, and at the high levels you're powerful, you're a leader of nations, a ruler of men, you kind of run the show. And in levels, that's usually accomplished by giving you kind of bigger numbers, right? Especially when it comes to a game like Pathfinder, which is guided primarily by the roll of a d20. The higher level you are, the less the d20 kind of impacts that, right? At low levels, the d20 is way more than your bonuses could ever be. And as a result, your character's influence on the world is really determined by the roll of that die. Um, and as you get higher level, your number itself grows larger. And as it does so, the impact of the die becomes less and less. Your character becomes more certain, your character becomes more powerful, and that all makes sense. I think everybody, when they play that, they get a sense of that feeling as they go up, and I think everybody comes to expect it. Now, how does that play into the economy? Well, the economy is a part of that, right? The economy is part of the way you get those numbers. The system by which you go from having an ordinary iron longsword to having a +1 sword, to having a +2 flaming sword, to having a +3 keen sword, etc., etc., until you go up to high levels where you've got mighty artifact weapons that are crushing foes with a single swipe. But that system has to play together, right? There needs to be a progression of items, and it can't happen too fast because, once again, we don't want to kind of skew the feel of the game. We don't want to upset the apple cart and give you something too powerful too early, and we don't want you to not have more powerful things later on. So what that tends to boil down to is this concept that assuming magic items have a price, which I'll touch on later, maybe why they shouldn't, but assuming magic items have a price, you can't have a system where a +2 sword is the price of 2 +1 swords. The reasons for this are that what that is a more linear scale of value, right? So if a +2 sword costs 2,000 and a +1 sword is 1,000, then you could trade 2 +1 swords in for a +2 sword. Well, you see where this is going. Over time, you could very quickly build up to a +5 sword, much faster than the game engine probably wants you to. And that's based entirely upon the price of the items, right? This price kind of determines the rate of acquisition, regardless of how monsters drop items and how treasure appears in the game, assuming that you want characters to find magic weapons and magic armor on moderate frequency. Not every day, but you don't want them to be so rare that when they find one, it's a rare treasure. So I'm talking kind of mid-fantasy, not high, where they're everywhere, not low, where they're nowhere, kind of in the middle, where you find them on occasion. And in that setting, you don't want the players to take their wealth and consolidate it up too quickly, because if they do, you don't have space to go, right? There's only a certain limit you can go before the numbers kind of get outrageous and ridiculous, and you can't go any further. So if a +2 sword can't cost the price of 2 +1 swords because it's too linear, you end up with instead with a system where it's more like a +2 sword costs the same as 5 +1 swords, or maybe even 10, right? That gives you enough breathing room to hand out some +1 swords, and you don't have to worry about them just upselling it into a +2 weapon, or then a +3 or a +4 or a +5 before they're ready, right? Assuming, you know, your engine allows for people to do that. But even if it didn't, if you have crafting or anything else, right, this game system still has to kind of play out that way. So what you're trying to do is give yourself enough space for niches, for areas where items can live and be valuable, and not be so valuable that you want to trade them out right away, and not be so kind of worthless that you don't really care that you got them. So they need kind of a spot that allows the players to be excited about them, that allows them to be not just any old other item that they got at that level, that makes them an exciting feature in the game. And you need enough of these spots to cover, in our case, 20 levels of play. So that's a lot, right? There, assuming your weapons are only going up to +5, you know, which ours do, that means you can only give one out about once every 4 levels or so, right? Otherwise, you don't have enough to give out. You end up kind of running out of space to give things. There's other things you can do too, but just to keep things simple, we'll start with that. So assuming you have all these niches and you want to kind of fill them up, that exponential kind of pricing, as opposed to linear pricing, right, needs to apply to kind of everything. It can't just apply to magic swords, because otherwise they don't play well with the rest of the items. So all of the items in the game kind of need this exponential growth curve of cost. And what that does for you is it allows you to kind of populate the thing with the game with enough magic items and enough varying prices that you're always kind of reaching for the next step up. And you're not necessarily using the stuff from the lower levels to leapfrog the system too much, because the scale isn't linear, which is kind of what you want. You kind of want people to get their items and use them, and not necessarily just run off to sell them. Not always. That's the goal anyway. And what this allows you to do is, you know, I said we want to avoid kind of the linear system, and we want to kind of have a more exponential price cost. That's not always the case. I do want to kind of give an exception on this. At low levels, we kind of want an exponential price cost, because we want every item to feel magical and new, and not just something mundane that you could make or craft. In a game like Pathfinder, where we do have crafting, we do kind of want a middle phase, though. That's a little bit more like linear and a little bit less like exponential. And the reason for that is, in the middle levels, that's when your characters are coming into their own, they're crafting some items, they're kind of in more control of their own destiny. We want them to feel like they can manipulate that a little cleaner by making the prices a little flatter through the middle, a little bit more linear and a little bit less exponential. And this allows crafters to kind of take a couple lower level items and get something of the same level, or maybe even something of a higher level, which allows everyone to kind of customize and kit out their gear. It allows you to sell and buy items and kind of make your character into the kit that you want your character to be. We want you to kind of find the niche for your character, and we want you to buy and sell items to kind of make that work. But then when we get to higher levels, when the items start getting really rare and wondrous and strange and unusual, we want to go back to that exponential system. We don't want you crafting those as much. There should be rare outliers, but in general, we kind of want those to be all kind of rare and unique and not necessarily something more like crafting. We want these to be like the rarest of most powerful magic items in the game, and we want you to find those and treasure them. And that means that if you do decide to sell them, you can maybe pick up a handful of lower level items, and that's okay, right? We kind of want you to realize that these are so good and so rare and so powerful that that's a bigger trade-off. So where does this all go wrong? Everything I've described makes sense. That's kind of how 3.5 worked, right? The prices were mostly exponential. You saw that in a lot of the pricing formulas in earlier versions in Pathfinder in 3.5 and 3.0. You saw these exponential formulas where it said the bonus squared times 1,000 or 100 or something, and that kind of led to this steeper curve of costs, and that's good. But there's some problems, and they're not readily apparent. But that approach creates a system wherein you can take the +2 item and turn it into 3 +1 items. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but 3 or 4 even +1 items. And they may not all be in the same thing, right? And they're not all going to be armor bonuses, but some of them might be bonuses to various skills or saving throws or other parts of the game, right? Whatever. But it quickly becomes apparent that you can take a more powerful item and turn it into several lower level items. That's okay, right? We don't mind you doing some of that, right? Some of that's just you customizing, some of that's creating the sort of play experience that you want. That's not bad. But what we found is that over time, you started looking at some of the cooler niche items for their value and then converting those into lower level pluses and minor bonuses as well, because you could stack them all on top of each other, get the same benefit as a higher level bonus, but not pay the same price. It allowed you to kind of bypass the system, to kind of find a route through, because ultimately, the job of a player, of a player character, is to find the best way to be the best character they possibly can be at their level, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's the drive of playing the game. You want to become better. You want to become more powerful. You don't want to let down the rest of your team. It is a team-based game, and if you're not pulling your load and people die because of it, well, you have a bad time, and so would everybody else at the table. So you want to be a responsible player and get kind of the most pluses you can possibly get. Nothing wrong with that. But this did tend to mean that you had a system wherein the items got cooler and cooler, but you didn't necessarily want them until you reached a certain critical mass, right? Until you had as many pluses as you could possibly load on your character, and then maybe you upgraded a few of them. But really, you were looking to spread as thin as possible because that's how you got the most bang for your buck, right? You took that gold and made it into as many pluses as you possibly could. Buying the +5 might cost you, 25 times the cost of a +1. That tended to mean that unless the +5 was really something you wanted or was in the core competency of your character, that immediately got sold off and turned into something else. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Well, isn't there a way that you could make the values exponential as well? That way, it's an exponential cost, but an exponential value to the player as well. That way, the thought of selling that down is ludicrous because you don't get any better bonus. You might as well keep the better thing. And that has been tried. I think some MMOs have certainly done that, where they've allowed their numbers on bonuses to go through the roof. That kind of works. It works better for a computer game than it does a tabletop game because the computer does all the math for you, right? I mean, look at I'm thinking of any number of very popular MMOs, and you see numbers where it's like, oh, this item gives me a bonus of 340. Well, that number eventually just becomes a point of comparison. It doesn't actually mean anything to you in the game environment. Whereas in Pathfinder and tabletop games, those numbers have to be part of your equations. Otherwise, they literally are just comparative numbers. And telling you, hey, roll a d20 and add 300 is probably not the way we want to go. So other games have tried to solve this in different ways over the years, right? You know, D&D started out with no prices at all. You couldn't buy and sell things, generally speaking. Your GM might make exceptions, and I think a lot of GMs had magic item shops, but they were usually pretty limited in scope. They didn't have a lot of things. They kind of only had the things the GM allowed you to have. You know, or you just couldn't do it at all. Magic items were too rare and valuable. No one ever sold them. When you had one, you kept it and hoarded it. And that worked, although it did have a different kind of offset problem that over time your character sheet would slowly become littered with low-level items that you didn't use. And then you kind of became this, you know, jingling bag of trinkets and baubles. There were some cool parts about that. There was those moments where you suddenly went, aha, I have that scroll from second level that I could use, and we're 15th, and this will solve all of our problems. And everybody had a good time. But more often than not, those items just got forgotten and left on your character sheet and became kind of cruft in the edges. And instead of that, you know, some games started allowing you to sell them off, kind of condense them up. You know, when you got to late second edition and magic item prices became more common, and then you got into third, and they became ubiquitous, and you got into Pathfinder, and then they became tightly tied into the crafting system. All of a sudden, the prices became really important. So if that wasn't a way to kind of solve the problem, so third edition and Pathfinder went to item slots. And they said, okay, well, you can only have so and so many items on your character. And that was a way to say, hey, don't just load yourself down with 1,000,000 plus ones. You only have so and so many slots. So, you know, you can only have so and so many bonuses. And there was another attempt on that on the bonus types. But in Pathfinder first edition, that was too broad. It went in too many directions. You had an awful lot of bonus types. You had an awful lot of slots. And you had a lot of items that were slotless and gave bonuses. The end result of this was that it didn't really serve as a check or balance at all. Characters would pile bonus on top of bonus on top of bonus, trying to cram every different bonus type as high as possible on their character. And most of the time they would settle for a +1 and a +2 here. But when you add up 10 of those, all of a sudden the game starts to deform. You end up being ridiculously good in the things that you're targeted at to the point where you almost can't fail. You know, it was regular for us to see characters that were like, well, what's your acrobatics? Oh, +50. There wasn't really anything in Pathfinder First Edition that needed an acrobatics score of +50, right? I mean, once you were that high, it was kind of ridiculous. The game just allowed you to do kind of whatever you wanted within the bounds of that skill. So item slots kind of worked. They kind of didn't. They were a stopgap. They're a band-aid on the problem. I don't know that they really solve it. And to be clear, I don't know that any solution is really going to solve it. So by now, you're probably figuring out where I'm going with all of this, where this all came from. I saw a lot of people talking about resonance. We even had Stephen in the office do a great blog post talking about resonance and some of the reasons of why we were doing it. The thing that wasn't really touched on deeply to my satisfaction was this question of economics. Like, how does this play into it? How does economics and resonance, how do these two things meet? Well, the thought here, and I do want to stress that it's a thought. We're still playtesting, we're still making around the things, and I don't want to make this video all about Pathfinder 2nd Edition and resonance, but it does tie into it, so it's worth mentioning. That resonance is trying to serve as a counterforce, whereas money says, get the most for the least. Resonance says you only can have so many, so get the most. It's trying to force you to do the opposite. And that might be the heart of the problem, to be honest, the forcing part. The part that says, this is all stick and no carrot. Not sure on that. We're kind of waiting for more feedback. But the thought there is that if you only have so and so much magic that you can use in a day, if there's a limit, if there's a top of the sky limit, you're kind of forced to start looking at those +1s and going, yeah, I really should just upgrade that to a +2 because 2 +1s is now burning twice as much resonance. So you really kind of want to turn those into 1 + 2. Because the moment you do, now you've freed up another point of resonance, which means you can get another bonus on your character. That's what we want. I don't know that it's playing out that way yet. But then again, we don't really know much of anything. It's still a little early. We finally started getting some feedback on 4th level characters. Hopefully in the coming weeks, we're going to start getting 7th and higher level characters, which should start giving us a better picture as to how it's actually working. Is it the right solution? I don't know. I don't know. There are other options we could employ. There's certainly other ways you can try and solve this problem. You could go back to a slot system, but make it a little looser, but create a tighter cap. You could say instead of having, 14 body slots all over you, maybe you can only have a number equal to 5 plus your charisma. That's it. That's all you get. We don't care where they are. Put them wherever you want. You want to wear 5 rings? You want all those to be rings? Knock yourself out. We don't really care anymore. Is that the solution? I don't know. Seems a little tight, little punitive. I'm not sure. We could make changes to consumables. We could say, they're more expensive. Maybe you can't use as many of them. Maybe, wands don't have 50 charges anymore per day. Maybe they're more like permanent items you can just use a couple times a day. Maybe that's a solution. We could try harder economic limits. We could say, in the game world, you can never buy more than one of these in a given place. Some of that feels really artificial. I'm not sure that that's much of a solution, but you could play with things like that. We certainly have a system of commonality now that maybe that could be used to help solve this problem. We were kind of thinking it might, but still, that still requires a lot of GM fiat, and your play experience then might be kind of uneven. One GM might roll it one way, one GM might roll it another, and then you're left kind of going, I don't know what to expect, which is not the worst thing in the world, but it is something we try to avoid in game design. We want you to have a predictable experience. We want you to sit down at the table and know that you're going to have a good time and know that it's going to work the way that the rules have kind of taught you how it works. It's not universal, but that's kind of a goal. The more we can do that, the more we can get you to kind of have the same play experience time after time, leads you to have a better understanding of the game and the world around you in that game, and that's a good goal. But none of these is quite perfect. All of them are trying to get at a problem that fundamentally is one that's maybe too techy to solve with simple rules. Maybe it's a combination of things. Maybe we'll play with one part and another and we'll see how they fit together and work. Only time will tell. And for Pathfinder and Pathfinder 2nd Edition, this is kind of our job. This is one of the bigger things we knew we'd have to playtest. It's one of the things that when we went into this system, we always knew was one of the trickiest widgets. We spent more time on the economy than a lot of other major subsystems. It took us like a full month and a half to kind of play around with different models and see how we could make those numbers work. It was funny, during that period we played around, this is how we ended up with silver being the main coin of the game. We ended up with silver because the numbers as they scaled up became so big that the gold coin number ended up being kind of ludicrous. So we're like, if we bump it down to silver, now the number isn't so ridiculous. You don't end up with 500,000 gold pieces or something at high levels, which, to be honest, starts to strain credulity. It also allows us to say things like castles cost $1 million, and to build and create and maintain, and magic items are good and all, but they it's hard to trade one for a castle, which always kind of seemed ridiculous. Anyway, I think that about covers up my thoughts here for today. I've just been playing around with this for a while. I didn't really have a good place to talk about this, so I thought I'd open up my old YouTube channel and see if anybody was interested. If you want to see more videos like this with me just kind of talking about design, philosophy, and principle, let me know in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe. That's another good way to tell me that you're interested in more content like this. So until next time, good luck playtesting. Have fun. Let us know what you think. Continue playing your game, and give that economy some thought before you just randomly go out and buy a horde of +1 items. Your GM will thank you. Until next time.